Thanks, everyone. So I'm super excited to be here and chatting with Chris, because Chris is one of the best thinkers on climate policy that I know. And as you'll know, he advises the governments of the UK, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, I guess, as well, on net zero and the like. And so that's brilliant. So we're going to just get straight into it. So net zero perspective, from a corporate and investor perspective. We have several corporates in the room, finance people, pension fund people. I would just say that we do have to acknowledge that there kind of has been some good news over the last 5 years. Because if you go back 5 years ago, corporate net zero wasn't even really a thing, right? It hadn't even been properly dreamed about. And today, fast forward to now, we're thinking about how do we actually do it. And so you think that, and it is also echoed if you look at sort of median policy estimates. So even 5, 10 years ago, you were kind of looking at, well, a 4-degree world, looking at what we were looking at was seeming quite likely. And whereas today, if you look at the median policy, you're kind of looking at between a 2 and 3-degree world-ish. So better, although with some way to go. So we have moved some way around, and I think that's important to note. So thinking corporate net zero and acknowledging that, what do you think investors should be looking for and asking in terms of their corporates there? I mean, we've had previous discussions where it can go wrong, no understanding of the policy context or real world impact, but obviously we've also got some things right.
Yeah, wow. So there's a lot in that. And first of all, let me just say thank you very much for the opportunity to come speak to you all tonight. Corporate net zero, so you said it was a thing, and I think it's a good question whether it really is a thing. Right? So I think that's been something that I've watched. I've been in this job now for approaching 6 years, and my sort of time frame is that, really. And you're right, there was nothing like this 6 years ago, and now there is. So I think it's worth to say, just before we get into the investor question, that I do regard that as positive, but it could quickly turn sour. So we are seeing net zero commitments from corporates. They've dried up a little recently, I would note as well, but we certainly saw a kind of rush towards lots of net zero commitments. And I think many of those commitments were made without any real sense of what that would entail in reality to deliver them. So kind of big question running alongside this is, how do we turn this sort of momentum into something that is genuinely useful for the actual transition? We've done a bit of work on that, so we've looked at that, and one of the things that we've noticed sadly recently is that those corporate commitments often carry a lot of risky things within them, notably offsets. So you've got this kind of idea that, you know, we've got a net zero target, we better deliver it, so let's just do that with very cheap offsets. And sadly, that sort of idea of a net zero target on paper isn't really very helpful at all. So that maybe takes me to the kind of answer to your question, I suppose, which is that I think investors, I hope, should care about the reality of net zero. So we should be looking at whether the corporate community writ large is genuinely pushing progress, and I think there are ways to do that. So I think that, you know, the kind of two broad things that I think we need to see, and it's not just investors that need to see it, is firstly some sort of framework for bringing together plans for transition for corporates, which includes within it a bit more than just disclosure. So this is about actual planning in corporates and encouraging that to take place in a consistent way, in a meaningful way, and crucially in a way that then investors can scrutinise. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is back to the kind of policy questions that run right the way through all this. We've done, again, and we and others have done quite a lot of work on the importance of having policy from government that allows investors to invest well in net zero. So, you know, that means having investable policies, which is, you've got to kind of think that through. But that's the success in the UK where we've had it has been when we've thought from the perspective of investors about what would be needed to make this transition work. So you look at all the good stuff that's been done in the power sector with renewables, for example. We need more of that attitude. And I think investors should be calling for that. So, you know, in terms of how change takes place, when the demand for policy is most strong, I think, is when you've got a collection of people, not just the Climate Change Committee, but also a host of investors and corporates themselves and others saying that there is a space that has to be filled here with policy, and if so, we'll be able to come in with capital at the right level. So I think that there is lots still to do on this, you know, this corporate net zero thing is something I think we're going to have to keep coming back to, because my big worry is that actually in the end this becomes more problematic And we'll have to sit here and have another discussion about how we unwind all this.
So let's pick up on two of those pieces. So transition plans, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, and then the policy piece. So on transition plans, one of the things I hear back from corporates of all stripes is that there is this tension essentially between growth, and sometimes they would say their scope 3, and some of their commitments. So most corporates want to grow in some respect, and at least in the short term, a lot of that growth is still associated with absolute carbon growth, even though their relative intensity can come down. And you have businesses, people who run hotels or industries and they're kind of really grappling with that. How should we think about that tension between the growth element, which I guess harks to economic growth and what you might want in terms of profits, and there's relative things, and how should we be thinking about advice on scope 3, or to what extent you're in control, and to what extent investors should even be calling for something there?
Gosh, there's a lot in that one. I mean, I think the scope, let's deal with the scope 3 thing. It actually links back to the question before that. So, I mean, I think it's very, very important that corporates think about scope 3. I think it's equally true to say that scope 3, which for those of you who don't follow this, I suspect there aren't many in here, is the kind of broadest sense of the carbon footprint of an entity. Is also a wild west. There isn't a consistent basis on which to measure scope 3. You can't add everything up to 100. It's a difficult discussion. For all those reasons, we should start measuring it. So I think the important thing with scope 3 is not to ignore it. That said, I think it is entirely right that for those areas where you can be more certain of what's happening within the supply chain of a business, you can be really tough on scope 1 to 2. I think so we can start at that. But you're having something that looks at scope 3, definitely. This thing about the kind of our growth arguments, I mean, there's a much broader discussion about this, which involves things like the degrowthers and all of that. I'm very much open to the suggestion that growth is the problem, but equally, I do think you have to have the ability for gain through this, and growth is, we've kind of mixed together growth and wealth, I think, often in the discussion of what we mean by growth. Growth is society's growing, choices growing with that, and I think there is a world of much more abundance which net zero brings you if you're willing to make, in the next 10, 20 years, the big capital investments that open that up. And then you remove a lot of those growth constraints, which are linked ultimately to the use of fossil fuels. So I suppose what I'm saying is I'm quite happy, really, that growth is a target, that the need for growth is pretty important in all of this, but not unconstrained. You've got this, I think this is the importance of scope 3, that you're actually thinking more broadly, if you're measuring it properly, about what impact you're having, and then you get into trade-offs and difficult discussions about whether to do that thing that might impact on the bottom line positively, but have a very negative impact on the climate. And that is only revealed if you're measuring it properly and putting a plan around it.
Sure. So I think there is agreement on the measurement piece. To put you on the spot with a question that investors have no answer to at the moment, is there's an argument amongst some investors that for certain industries, or even most companies, we need to have some sort of scope 3 target. And there's others who say that actually what we know now, a target might be counterproductive. Yes, definitely to the measure, but you don't want to constrain companies. There's problems with innovations and growth. Do you have a view about how we should be looking at scope 3 targets or not? Or is it still the answer that it's actually complicated and we don't really know?
Yeah, so how should I answer this question? So in scope 3 terms, the thing I deal with most is not corporate, it's national, right? So let's think about so national scope 3 emissions, which is not really a thing, but what I mean. That's our carbon footprint here in the UK. Again, that's a big part of the story over the last few years, is that we have targets in this country that are based fundamentally on production emissions, territorial emissions, but we know we have a bigger footprint. And I think we are not yet at the point at UK level when we should have a target for our full carbon footprint, because still 2/3 of it or thereabouts is the emissions produced here, where you have the greatest capacity to change, and the rest of it is you don't have the direct levers over it, and targets where we don't have levers tend to be difficult things. What we've started talking about within my organisation in the CCC, you'll see this in the report we publish in the next couple of weeks, is something that has a sort of monitored pathway. So we think there is a path ahead for the global carbon footprint. So we think we can track what it would mean to achieve the Paris targets, for example. And we think we can also give measure of progress against that for the UK. So are we seeing the kind of progress that we would need to be seeing beyond UK's borders for those things that we are responsible for to be in line with the Paris targets? And can we put some metrics around that of progress? I think we're not. I don't think that's a target. I think that I worry about targets, and similarly in corporate world, I would worry about a target that you can't, meet. So these things tend to be devalued at the point when they become difficult, I think. So I'm much more clear that we should have targets over things that you can actually achieve with the levers available to you directly, and they are then something you can hold, whether that CEO or Prime Minister to account for.
So you can get the strategy right even if you don't have that target in place. So thinking then still on the transition plan piece, so what's coming up, particularly actually in UK corporate now, is corporates are presenting their climate plan or transition plans to investors to vote on. This is a sort of newish thing, but it's happening, and it's happening more widely. And there is more work on, well, actually now we're turning around and going, what do we actually even really want to see in transition plans? And a lot of investors realizing that they don't quite know, and having that expertise. And I know actually there's a transition plan group going on, which you're part of. So what's your kind of thinking at the moment for what kind of pieces in a good transition plan that would be seeing on the corporate level? And I guess that then is the kind of thing that investors should be looking for, so it kind of goes hand in hand.
Yeah, so this is probably not the forum to go through every piece of the transition plan. I think there's a story in that, actually. So I've been involved with something called the Transition Plan Task Force, and then maybe people in the room have also been involved in it. And it's a Treasury-inspired thing. So the general idea, going back to the answer to my question a few minutes ago, actually, is that there should be some common basis for transition planning so that you build greater transparency in this. Actually, you also catalyse greater action on it corporately. If there's a way to do planning well, it should result in action at the end of it. So really easy for me to sit here on this platform and talk about that. Fiendishly difficult, it turns out, to actually do it. And we're in a world now where we've had, I don't know how many changes of administration we've had recently in the UK. There's quite a lot. And the figures involved in the first inception of it, actually one of them is now the Prime Minister, so that's helpful. But the whole point of the transition plan, it's sort of the inception of it feels like an eon ago. So we're at this kind of interesting moment where actually every stage you've got to kind of remake the argument for transition planning to be a regulated thing, make the argument that the UK can lead that. I'm very confident that can still be done. So the arguments for having a common basis for transition planning, the argument for the UK to lead that, the arguments for that to be tied in some way to the City of London because financiers should care deeply about it, I think they all stack up. The bit that's difficult is whether it should be mandatory or not. So we've got this framework that I'm very pleased to be associated with and that I've worked on, but it's bloody difficult. So you get this if you want to do transition planning well, it turns out it's actually very hard. And we knew that before we started, but the level of detail that we're into in what we call just the sector neutral framework is difficult. There's no doubt about it. And that's before you get into the more specific stuff for particular sectors that needs to be there too. So I think this is probably going to be a thing where we need to walk a bit before we run. We're sandboxing it right now. It does work. It's a really excellent thing that I think we will come up with at the end of this. When you introduce that to the broader community, I don't know what the reaction to that will be. I suspect some people will go when they see it. So I think this is probably longer run than I thought. And it chimes with something else I think that we've seen over the time. We've seen the Bank of England and other central banks do climate stress tests of the financial system. What those tell you is that is a very useful thing to do, but the main thing that we've got from it in the first iteration of those stress tests is actually we don't know very much. And I think there's a lot of that actually still to come, that we need to go through this, constant iterations of process, and each time make a step forward. And the beginnings of this is mainly about finding out how much we really know, and we're probably going to find out we don't know nearly as much as we think. So I think that if that's true at central bank level, it's definitely true at corporate level. And even for the largest corporates, this is a journey that we're on now. I still think it's incredibly worthwhile. The other thing I'll just maybe bring in at this stage is that my thing is climate. I suspect in this room, your thing is climate too. But when you're into this question of whether you're doing transition planning, immediately you ask yourself questions about what else could you do alongside the carbon stuff and the climate stuff. Could we look at nature and biodiversity as a thing that comes up? Even within climate, could we be looking at climate risk and adaptation, for example? It starts to get very complicated. And I suppose my view coming into this more and more now and thinking about it more and more is that I do think starting narrow and then getting wider is probably the way to do this, actually, that we've got to make sure that we've got something that we know works and then bring in more stuff. But I definitely feel the idea of sort of mandatory or at least advisory transition planning is here to stay, and it's hugely valuable. Sure,
it's part of the human condition. We end up not really knowing as much as we thought, and then that narrowed to why, because you just climate change committees produced a really good report on jobs, right? So jobs as part of the transition is definitely going to be a piece. And so thinking maybe transition into policy, maybe one of the bridging things is, so typically investors think of themselves as non-political. They're probably a little bit more political than they think, but more recently, kind of the core of investors, we've kind of been hit from left, right, up and down. So on the kind of one arm, you have a lot of people saying, more divestment, more aggression on net zero, you're not doing enough. And then we've got pushback saying, well, ESG is illegal, you can't do this, it's too woke, you've got caught up in the culture wars, you're not thinking about your fiduciary duty. Then they flip back and saying, well, if you don't think about climate, you're not thinking about your fiduciary duty. That has actually been much more typical of climate kind of generally. There's an observation that we are having a more polarized world in some aspects. This kind of comes into our ongoing conversations about fairness as being a big issue within policy world. But maybe reflecting on that, do you have any lessons or thoughts for investors trying to navigate this left, right, up and down and trying to piece through for this? And so there's some of these tensions. It's like, well, growth, scope 3, we want to do the right thing, we're getting from both sides. You've got quite a lot of silent majority in the middle. Any lessons from overall climate policy?
I don't know if I can advise investors on this at all, actually. But I think what you've described is exactly what we see happening. So I think this very polarised discussion, and when it comes to the investment community, I think the way you characterise it is right. You've got this kind of activist community on the right, which is very much about disinvestment and ending things. On the left, and then on the right. Actually, I don't know. Who knows where they are?
Up, down,
but exactly up down. But definitely on the right, in the Republican right in the US, particularly, you've definitely got this kind of idea that the shareholder revolt, as it's sometimes referred to. I don't think it is a shareholder revolt, but it's a revolt from certain wings of the Republican Party, at least. And this idea that you can't do any of this stuff because you're kind of breaking the kind of central rules of capitalism here. The problem with this is that there's a kind of metaphor in here, I suppose, a tale really, which is what we see playing out everywhere. So back to non-investment land, look at the challenge that we've got. One of the big challenges we've got in the UK at the moment, well, not just the UK, but it's the challenge in the UK as far as I'm concerned, is what do you do about gas boilers, right? So you've got this kind of question about all the options you've got to decarbonise the building stock in this country, and this discussion about whether hydrogen might play a role in that, or heat pumps. And I was in Denmark last year talking about this thing, and they couldn't get their head around the fact that this has become the culture war. This idea that heat pumps are some sort of expression of the fear that we're now living under in this in this world. But that's true, that's what's happened. You've got this very polarized discussion about these two technologies, which you get this very heated debate, and that's a recipe for not doing anything at all. And I think that's the answer I would give to this question, actually, is that there is if you focus on the polar extremes, you miss the fact that 80-90% of this is actually really well understood, and we know what to do on it, and we need to do some rewiring to make it work. But it's never going to be an interesting news story, is it? So I think that I spoke this morning at a fascinating event kicking off the Edinburgh TV Festival, and there's loads of interesting broadcasters wanting to do something on climate. And I said something similar to them, actually, which is that the message on climate that we get from our broadcasters is either catastrophized, or it's that it can't be done. There's a sort of there is nothing in the middle, and yet that's where most people are. I'm sure that's true of investors as well. So we've got to find a way to make sure that we keep returning to the stuff that we know we need to do, And again, in this country, we've got, I think, probably the most detailed sense of what the country as a whole, a country of an economy of this size, what we need to do to fully decarbonise it, and indeed to be, resilient to climate change. We should be focusing on those things where there really isn't much contention at all, which, by the way, would include lots of the discussion on gas boilers. But more of that, please. So yeah, there is obviously lots to be resolved and lots of extreme things that we don't know the answer to, which do need to be debated. But we are squeezing out the simple stuff, which is the majority of it.
And so that's quite a good segue into maybe that policy piece in terms of what investors and maybe corporates should be thinking of. So we've discussed before that, so economists, you get a bunch of economists or macroeconomists in a room, and I think 80 or 90% of them just say carbon tax, job done. But these are also the same economists who did miss the great financial crisis, the last 7 recessions, and didn't seem to predict our latest bouts of inflation either. So a lot of fundamental investors are a little bit like, yeah, not certain that this rational economist is the way that we want to follow. And there is a political economy question on that overall carbon tax. So we know the rational economist has said, that's it. But then thinking about, and I get these questions from corporates sometimes, and then also with where investors should ask for, what are maybe the policies that we should be leaning towards? And it tends to be a little bit more sector-led. So, the buildings people will be asking me certain things, the healthcare people will be asking me certain things, and within the sector decarbonization thing. But are there things on that policy where, there is a sort of consensus in the middle, or some things that we should nudge for, so that when we are talking about it, or we make sure that the left hand and the right hand and the lobby groups are aligned, what are the kind of things that we should be thinking of? And, within that, maybe thinking about political economy, and that's why carbon tax has been tricky, and that these maybe some other things to be thinking about.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, maybe to bring it back to the UK. So I am not making a prediction here, but we will have a general election at some point over the next year or so, and I don't know what will come at the end of that, but there'll be some form of new government at the end of it. So just to be very clear, Chatham House or not, I'm not saying that it's I'm expecting a new government. What I mean by that is we will have some new parliament with a new government in it, with the capacity to think about some of the issues that you just talked about more clearly. When you're at the tail end of a parliament like this, it's very difficult to do some of the major tax reforms, for example, that we might need in the future. So I think this issue of what policy instruments we are deploying is very, very live at the moment, because if you want to see change, and I think we do need to see change in some of these big levers, you need to be having that discussion now. So I say very freely to this audience, I say we need to have a discussion now about some of these big policy levers that we use for decarbonisation. So again, I'm not sure I can tell an investor what to push for, but what my view on this has actually changed quite a lot in the last few months, although it's broadly still what we talked about last time you and I had a chat, Ben. But there's some new evidence coming out now, sort of very much supporting some of the stuff that I've said in the past about this. So you're right, I'm not sure you would get a 90% consensus from those economists for carbon taxation, but some form of carbon taxation is clearly helpful because it gives a signal. I think if you went back in time and had, maybe 10, 20 years ago, you would have had a much stronger consensus that carbon taxation is the way forward. I always note at this point that the strongest advocates for carbon taxation are the oil and gas sector. And I suspect they are the strongest advocates because they know how hard it is to implement in real political economy terms. So what's been interesting recently is the way you presented it, you've got this as though it's an option. You can either do carbon taxation or you can have this sectoral approach with kind of regulations and standards and laws. And actually, I think the optimal thing is a mix. And we've sort of happened upon that in the UK in those sectors where we've tried it. So and there's some evidence recently, I tweeted about this recently, it's a really good paper which actually started to measure the efficacy of a mix. And what you see essentially is that the polarized view, that doing it all with carbon taxation or doing it all with regulation, I'll call it that, is ineffective. You get sort of diminishing returns if you try to do that. But the kind of the initial phase of regulation and an initial phase of carbon taxation at low levels is very effective. So you get this sort of mixture of a bit of signalling through carbon tax plus a regulation is probably the best way through. So think that through to kind of challenge of decarbonising transport. That's our biggest single sector of emissions at the moment. Some form of tax measure giving a signal to motorists to move off high carbon fuels, plus a regulation that says we should stop selling petrol and diesel cars by 2030, very effective. Very good way to do it. And you can kind of think through what that might mean in other sectors. I think the reason I say I've changed my mind slightly on this recently, well, I'm not sure I've changed my mind, but what's made me think again about this is the US. So if you look what's happened with the US and the Inflation Reduction Act, the US cannot have a climate act because there is not ever going to be the consensus you need in Congress for that. What you can have in Congress is a fiscal act that pushes financial, be that tax credits or production subsidies or subsidies for consumers. And that is what they've done with the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's quite interesting because it's a kind of cast back to where we were years ago. Let's throw money at stuff, see what happens. And that's what the Inflation Reduction Act is. It's an incredibly valuable thing if you can get into the US and follow the rules. You can do that almost retrospectively as well, which is the other interesting thing that they're playing around with. But it is a blunderbuss, right? They've just thrown dollars at this challenge of green, and it's quite interesting. I think that is a challenge to either it's not the tax framing and it's not the regulation thing. It's production subsidies again, and there is some evidence out there to say that actually production subsidies are the most effective thing of all. So we are about to find out, and that's what's interesting to me. So the US has taken an approach which is not the same as the UK's, sort of European approach to this, which was moving increasingly towards that sort of sectoral driven thing. You need a plan for each sector. What they've said is, nah, let's just throw cash at it, see what sticks. And the way they've done it is just so interesting to me because it's the way they have to do it. So I think the kind of idea of the big levers is back in fashion again. Let's have a look at it again. And hands up, if you look at the many hundreds of things that the Climate Change Committee has produced over the years we've had it in the UK, 15 years now, we've never done a thing on carbon taxation. We've never done a thing on carbon pricing. It's a sort of assumption that it'll be there. I think it probably is time for us to look at some of that again. And back to your question about investors, I do think the kind of attitude of investors towards those things is probably the key determinant of what's successful in the end. You see that with the Inflation Reduction Act at least. Even if I'm wrong on the Inflation Reduction Act and it doesn't deliver, what it has done is massively attract attention. So I think attention is a commodity you don't have much of in this space. If you're in a boardroom in the UK and you have global interests, it's all in North America at the moment, just because that's the clamour. Yeah. And sort of pulling attention back again, you're back to that's not a rational response, but that's what we see.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely true. And if you think about it, a lot of the financial players have said the capital is available. Actually, there's a lot of saying like, we'll fund sustainable projects, green, or whatever it is, but we're not sure of this transition mechanism. And suddenly like, oh, well, the US have said like, okay, we'll throw open the levers there. That's a definite possibility. It does still seem that they have call it a permitting bottleneck, which seems to be across a lot of the developed world.
This is fascinating. Permitting is permitting, consenting, planning. These are the kind of. I think these are the key issues in the UK. If we talk about the transition here and across Europe, what will hold it up? Lots of things potentially, but the main thing I worry about is the getting physical infrastructure in the ground because it is a capital-intensive thing. And that is true in the US as well. There's an interesting impact that comes with that, I think. Those bits of the US that do the quick permitting are the bits of the US that have oil and gas. That's why oil and gas is there. So there's a link to I hate the term just transition if I'm honest, but there's a link to the employment question that goes with this, the just transition, whatever you can call it. That means that the subsidy through the era will go to the bits of the US that presently do oil and gas. That is probably the outcome you're looking for. It's a sort of way of achieving a geographical or spatial, incentive without expressing it clearly.
Yeah, and I guess the quid pro quo they said is, we'll try and make green permitting easier, but we'll also get brown permitting. We'll just do permitting. Yeah. And we'll get all of that done, and okay, we can argue about it, and then maybe try and let the market decide how it's going to fund it or not. It's so
interesting because I had recently had quite an interesting experience. I met along to all the chief execs of the NGOs. People imagine I spend my time with NGOs. I very rarely meet them because you end up in a freedom of information request and it's difficult. So meeting them all at once is quite convenient. So I met them all, and I've been spending ages talking about how the planning regime was broken. And the environmental NGOs all of whom are very supportive of climate action, all said no, the planning regime works very well, thanks. So there's a kind of, because they've got a broader set of interests. That's what's protecting nature. So it's a kind of interesting check on the things I've been saying, actually, that you've got to be careful about this. The permitting stuff is really, really important, and we do need to reform it if you want to see net zero happen in this country and across Europe. Europe is actually, I think, doing more on this now. The Commission's outlook in Europe is that this is a key lever. We haven't really used it and described it in those terms in the UK yet, because I'm not sure we have a key lever in this area. It's a very dispersed thing. But it's worth just reminding ourselves that it is also a very important protection against development in places that really can't sustain it. So I'm aware of that, and I think we need to have a better discussion about how you reform the planning regime in this country to deliver what you need for net zero.
And that seems to be on the cards coming through into a potential next government of what actually whatever stripe, right? It's definitely a well-worn thread on that. I guess thinking about the UK, or call it sort of transition markets, or where there might be market failure or nascent markets which need to be developed. You put out a really good piece with your team on adaptation and potentially adaptation markets. So we've had a lot of focus on mitigation, and there's a lot, but as you point out, and as we say, is like climate is changing now. It's here. And so, adaptation runs alongside. Again, it's probably not a name we quite like in terms of the word, but it does run alongside it, and we potentially should be doing more. How do you think we should be thinking about potential adaptation markets and where we might be behind, or where you'd like to see more work being done?
Yeah, adaptation is such an interesting topic, but such a tricky topic too. So where to start on this? I mean, I can talk about the UK. There are better places in the world to look at adaptation than the UK. And we talk a lot of guff, frankly, about our leadership on climate, and this is one of the ways in which you could demonstrate that it is guff, because we do a bit on flooding, because there's a political jeopardy there for ministers if they don't act on flooding. But the rest of it, we do very little, actually. And I think I hold my hand up. We are part of the problem, actually. We're part of the institutional framework that has led to that inaction on adaptation. Part of it is the word. I think you're right. I prefer climate resilience, so I talk about that now. I think the other thing we've got to get our head around on adaptation is that we need to achieve net zero in a warming climate. So this is increasingly how I talk about it, and that has pretty fundamental implications, actually. If you're going to invest a lot in the building stock of this country and make it decarbonised, and it is a lot of investment, you would clearly be better to try and make it climate resilient at the same time, and yet we don't have that discussion. In fact, we have a department that's not that keen on doing any of that stuff. Similarly, flood protection is something we should be thinking about as you make that investment. That is also true of the net zero power system. We did a report on that recently, very interesting. That's the first time we really tried to bring these two things together. We'll do more of that in the future. But as you decarbonise the energy system, you should also try and make it climate resilient, because if you don't, it doesn't work. It's a kind of interesting way into this. So I think there's going to be lots of these questions when it comes to adaptation. At the core of the problem, sort of skirting around the answer to your question here, is the fact that we have on the net zero side, or on the emissions abatement side, a quantified target. We've had that in place for quite a long time now, predates even the Climate Change Act in this country. Other places have had that too. And the fact that it's based on carbon, which is something we use right across the economy, means that it's a pretty fundamental thing. The fact that it's quantified means you can build pathways to it. You can then start to use those pathways to do things like regulate in the way that we just discussed, also to put targets around them, also to assess progress, also to allow the investment community to see what's happening, also to allow corporates to align themselves. So all that good stuff comes from having a quantified pathway ahead for the economy, for society. We have not got that on adaptation. So what we have is a very well diagnosed set of climate projections for the UK, for the globe. We have a pretty well developed sense of what risks that those climate projections bring to the country. Some of those risks are domestic, many of them are not, but we know what they are. What we haven't got, really, I think for me, really interesting, is a sense of how that impacts on the key systems that we rely on in our day-to-day life. So I think it's possible, at least here in the UK, I think it's probably possible elsewhere, but I don't claim to know that yet, for us to pull out less than 10 critical systems that we need in society today. I don't know whether systems is the right word, but these are the things we rely on. This is the built environment. This is the food system. This is, I could go on. And then assess the risk that we face today from climate change, how that changes over time, something we know a lot about. So it almost always increases. And then build from that kind of sense of the future risk, what adaptation actions can do to bring that risk down, giving you, for the first time, some sense of what a quantified outcome target would look like for that key system when it comes to adaptation. Then we start the business of building a pathway to it. So I think I think that's the challenge. That's not something you do overnight, but I think building that sense of a consensus around the things that really matter, a consensus around what the best outcome would be for the country or for that sector, however you're looking at it, and then building a sense of the costs and the benefits of that pathway as you make your way towards it. That allows you to do some of the stuff that we've done very well with net zero, I think, and allows you then to invite the investor community into that discussion as well. We are quite far away from that right now. So I think that would be super useful. And I think that, for me, is the way into this. So we're going to have a go at that over the course of the next few years in the CCC and see where we end up. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. I feel one of the gaps there is sometimes around what we might call narrative. So actually, investors have this, corporate narratives, what's the story that we want to tell? It sometimes even comes alongside or before the strategy. So I'd be interested in maybe what are the stories or the narratives that we want to be telling. And I think some of that is with another word that we don't like. It comes under behavior change, but isn't. It's this narrative of innovation or culture change or how that happens. And sometimes it can happen quite quickly, sometimes it happens slowly, but it tends to be, runs alongside a new thinking, a new narrative of within that. And I think that's one of the key pieces leading into that adaptation, because we aren't really thinking about that, even though it's what humans have done for hundreds and hundreds of years.
I think that this is the other aspect. So a few things on this, let's go a bit deeper on it. One of the reasons why I don't think we've developed those more quantified targets, let's call them what they are, targets for the future. So it's because it's quite a difficult discussion. You need politics to arrive at that target. And I mean politics in the broadest sense, how we make decisions as a society. We look to our leaders in politics to try and define some of that for us. And I'm afraid when you look at the critical systems that we rely on today, almost all of them, even in the best possible world where you put all the policies in place, are worse in the future than they are today. Yeah. And I'm afraid politicians don't like to admit to that, right? So, it's difficult to say that the risks we face as a country from flooding will be worse, even if you do everything that we tell you. And I think, therefore, it falls to a technical assessment. I think that's why we need to do some of this stuff. So the narrative here actually might be very difficult. The narrative, since you asked me about narratives, the narrative might be we can't make this better, and that's very challenging, very challenging. So I don't know. I hope that isn't the narrative, incidentally. I think the narrative needs to be, it could be hellish, but we can improve it. But, I don't know quite how to frame that up in the right way. But we're going to have to confront it because, as you say, you cannot avoid adapting to climate change. Yeah. That's the oddity of it. And I mean, it might be glib to say this, but I definitely feel that we, when it comes to, where we are now, just up the road from government in Whitehall, the people of this country are not in the same place now as politics when it comes to the question of climate risk. So I think that last year, the 40-degree day really did switch people on to the fact it's here. It's kind of funny that I don't think anyone doubted that was climate change. What I think's been interesting, I was talking about this with the broadcasters this morning as well, is that I was asked an interesting question about whether what it would take for us to kind of flip into actually acting on this as a country or globally. I don't think these events will do that now. I really feel that. If you look outside of the UK, look at Florida, in the US, one of the most affected states, well, probably the most affected state with climate change, and rising sea levels, fully acknowledge that it's happening, but can't talk about it. It's just and I think that is broadly what we will see, I'm afraid, that these events will keep coming. Look what's happening in New York right now. People basically know it's climate change, accept it, and then we don't get the bit after that we always thought we would get, where this massive clamour for action. So I think you've got to create the conditions for change in a more positive sense, I suppose is what I'm trying to say for this. So I think the narrative around adaptation has to be framed in a positive sense. The narrative for net zero has to be positive. The narrative for nature recovery has to be positive. You know, all this stuff has to be framed in the right way, building on the fact that people now accept it's happening. That is what's different, I think, from 10, 20 years ago.
Can't even get commercial insurance in Florida now, actually.
No, they actually have a
pulled
line
out
in the Florida state budget, which is the most I forget what it's called. It's the most contorted thing ever. That just to not mention climate change, but that's what it is. It's
the market signal has said we're not insuring you, but it's that. All right, we're going to do a quick section of overrated, underrated, and then turn to some audience questions. So you can pass or you can be neutral, quick fire. So we're going to go. Oh, we'll start with an easy one actually. Coal mines in Cumbria, overrated, underrated.
I just think it's a really shit idea. So I'm not sure whether it's overrated or underrated. It's just a stupid thing to do.
Overrated.
I will qualify this. I know you want quick fire, but I think it's one of the most destructive things that this government has done in the last 2 years is give the green light to that coal mine. It has undermined everything that they've done. They wrote a climate pact in Glasgow that was all about this and have completely undone that really with that single decision. And I think it was also, I don't know this, but I think it's quite possible it was done for the most kind of nefarious political reasons, that in the full knowledge that there will never be a coal mine, better to consent it because we'll get some sort of minor brownie points.
No banks will fund it. So.
It's madness.
Yeah, signalling. Okay, divestment strategies.
I think I don't know whether I never know how to answer that question.
Overrated. I don't think they're a good idea.
I don't think they're the best idea, but I think I'll add a layer to that. I think divestment is important if it means that if you've kind of gone through a prior filter of having asked the question, are you serious about, climate change? And there are certainly fossil fuel companies out there that are not serious about climate change, and the only possible response to that in that circumstance then is to divest. So I think invest in those corporates. I think this is important. Invest in those corporates that are actually invested in the transition. That's the message, and that it does include oil and gas corporates, and that's a difficult thing for people in my trade to get their head around.
Yep. Heat district networks.
Love district heating networks. Love, and I hope will have their day. Since we're in a room talking about market issues, that's the biggest challenge, I think. So in Scandinavia, they went full tilt for district heating as a result of a fossil fuel crisis. So if you go to a place like Denmark, for example, 2 oil crises in the 70s, they basically, because they were worried about energy security, they thought we're going to have district heating and we'll use our coal. They've therefore got a way to transition one of the most difficult things. We went for gas. District heating is a really brilliant thing, especially if you couple it with taking heat from rivers. So so basically you can put a big heat pump in a river. 80% of us live close enough to rivers in this country to have enough heat from the river to heat homes and buildings in that town. So I think it would be brilliant to do that. The problem is, where's the commercial case for it if you can't guarantee offtake? So, where's the demand? You need to mandate the demand before it can be constructed. So I think that, again, there's no easy choices in energy, but that's one of the most difficult ones. If you could do it, it's clearly a great technology.
Sure. Disclosure rules.
Love disclosure rules, but let's not get overexcited about them because it turns out that disclosing stuff is as far as it goes.
Yeah, first step.
You've got to act on it, yeah. So
Sure.
Again, hold my hand up. That's something I've been slightly surprised by and I shouldn't have been.
And the last one on this, AI.
Yeah, now, again, we just did a report on jobs, you mentioned it, and we had a bit in it about machine learning. Because we started it 2 years ago. And it's fun, I don't know, I'm an Apple nut, so I watched the keynote this week, and they notably didn't mention AI and did talk about machine learning, and I thought that's great. But what am I telling you here? We have not thought through the implications of AI when it comes to climate, and definitely need to. And I have a long list of things that the CCC might do, and that's one of them. I think it would just be fascinating to think about the interaction between AI and climate. I suppose I'm pretty positive about what it could deliver, but aware of the risks. But I think when it comes to something like a renewables-based power system, AI is revelatory, actually, if you can do that, and you can build digital twins of things and do AI on that, and you might have something that is tremendously exciting.
Yeah, my techno-optimist friends think this is the right tail event that they've been waiting for. They reckon this could be the enabler on that side. So last question before audience was, from your other life, you used to work on tax credits for films, or incentives really, in the film and creative industries. So any lessons from that? Because it was kind of a framework for incentive structures. I think that's really interesting. I actually have a lot of creative friends who essentially use that or use derivatives of that and wouldn't have a career otherwise. So any learnings from when you were looking at incentive structure?
Yeah, so you've made it sound like I actually worked in the industry. I didn't.
Wow.
So it's a
Treasury.
So I was in the Treasury and was part of the team that had to. And I met someone in the room. Maybe you might remember this. I've just literally told Ben the story, so I'll tell it to the audience. So the film regime has always, for a long time, there's been tax incentives for film production. And you might recall years ago, it used to be an incentive that attached to investors. So it was a kind of an investor incentive, basically made it cheaper for investors to put their money in films. It was widely abused. There's several schemes, and there was a point, I don't think I'm breaking any rules in Chatham House saying this, there was a point when the entire Arsenal football team was invested in a film called The Sex Lives of the Potato Men. At that point, ministers in the Treasury thought, I think the game is up. So we sort of pulled the subsidies overnight. I forget which day of the week it was, but the film ministry called it, I think it was Black Tuesday or something like that. I remember I'd got a phone call from very prominent members of the film ministry in Britain, asking what the hell we were doing. And then we got a period after that to reintroduce some sort of incentive, which we decided we would model on the research and development tax credit. That's the thing I worked on, and we turned that into the film tax credit. And it was crucially a production incentive. And I think it's been very successful. I did an interview recently for the New Statesman when I also mentioned this, and I talked about we were sort of halfway through this, but well, actually 80% of the way through the process of developing this film tax credit, full support of the film industry. It was all going really well. We were then members of the European Union, remember that? And overnight, we got this phone call from the European Commission. They said, no, you can't do what you're planning to do, it's illegal. And so my first lesson from this is you make sure you got all your stakeholders lined up before you tell anyone about it. So that was the only time that Dickie Attenborough ever phoned me at my desk, because he said he wasn't too pleased about it. He got wind of it. But the kind of main lesson I take from it, there is definitely something in all this, that the production subsidies, we're back to this again, are very, very effective if you frame them up well. And that is to come back to climate, that's a lever we haven't really pulled so hard recently, I think, if I can put it that way, and perhaps we should look again at some of that. There is something of that ilk in something like hydrogen production, for example. We've got a bit of that going on, but back to the US, that's what they're doing. So they're looking at production subsidies, and there are some very learned economists kind of interested in what that happens. And Nick Stern, who many of you will know, is certainly of the view that production subsidies, if you frame them up correctly, are probably the most effective way through all this, actually. So my lesson from the film tax credit is not just make sure the European Commission are happy, it's that production subsidies are something we should probably look at harder.
And then my takeaway is you've got to beware what incentives you give investors, because what incentives you give them, they will go for, whether they are the Arsenal team or the other things.
Sex Lives of the Potato Men might be the other
exactly.
thing. But the reason that was so interesting, that I should have clarified this at the time, some very, very clever people who work in very learned, lawyerly institutions were making a lot of money out of driving a coach and horses through the tax system at that point. And they had found a way, perfectly legitimately in inverted commas, to get to a world where if the film lost money, the investor got more back. So which you might remember is the story of the producers, the stage show. So that's why it was Sex Lives of Potato Men. It was designed to be a terrible film, so that the Arsenal Football Club Arsenal football team members made more money that way. And you're absolutely right. Perverse incentives were enormous there, and you can hugely get that wrong. And I'll tie it back to the US again. They may well have got that wrong as well. I mean, I don't know what they're going to do in the US with all this green hydrogen, if the subsidy is as big as it looks.
Yes, the colour of hydrogen I favour is pink, actually, on that one. But we will turn it to the audience. So yeah, questions. Maybe we'll take two at a time. We'll just go for the two ladies in the front here. Go ahead. Oh, we need a microphone.
Hi, Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks very much, Ben. I'm Maria Carvalho, who's head of climate economics and data at NatWest Group. So my question really is, actually, it's an easy one. When is the date of the UK progress report coming up? Because I need to put that in my team's work stack. But
awesome. 28th of June.
Perfect. Okay.
And you're going to love it. It's a humdinger.
I definitely am, because the second question I have, I mean, we really are users of the progress report. It's a way in which we determine not only investable policies, but also we, NatWest, have our net zero and 2030 targets, science-based targets, validated by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So one is a comment on things like the SBTI being a net zero standard that has a clear framework, which also means you can't use carbon credits to achieve it. Yeah. But the second thing that I have is I'd actually warn you on that notion of not putting ambitious targets even for Scope 3. Because what I'll say is, as a user of this, including ones where we see there's gaps to targets, we are having very interesting conversations with the bank about being visionary about energy, mobility, habitat, food, and materials. How does that look like in a net zero economy? And what is a way in which that is a healthier world and a prosperous world? So it allows us to think financially about how to identify those opportunities and what are the ways we work across sectors to enable that. So one of those collaborations is also on data. And the thing that when I talk to people about this, the thing I don't understand is that they're asking a whole bunch of financial institutions or corporates to figure out their Scope 3. It doesn't make more sense to ask the government, who has the mandate, to ask for their Scope 1s of all the different facilities.
So yeah, possibly, yeah. I mean, this is a very good cue into something that I should have said earlier but didn't. So the most effective regulatory environment, whether it's disclosures or transition plans, is one that encourages corporates to align with those pathways I talked about. So very briefly on this, what we see is corporates setting net zero standards within the business, preferably Scopes 1, 2, and 3, finding that's very difficult, doing the stuff that they think is helpful, and actually what you find is most of that's counterproductive. So even things like putting solar panels on the roof, you might think that's a very sensible thing to do for a business, and of course it is sensible for them, but it's probably not going to help net zero, because we're on the path as a country to decarbonise power system. So actually, what you need is corporates knowing that we're on a path, nationally, to a decarbonised power system, and if they want to do more, focusing on something that the country needs to see progress on somewhere else. So, something I talk about quite a lot at the moment, actually, it would be better to turn your entire fleet of vehicles over to electric early, before the rest of the country does it, because that actually pushes the country on. So I'm not saying ignore power, but, do something that is more valuable somewhere else. So you can, I think, and this is what we're trying to do with the Transition Plan Task Force, frame that up in such a way that you end up with something that is about net zero alignment, where you have, I don't know whether it's targets. I suppose I don't like the term target, because the target means something legal to me, but a set of guides or goals that that we need to be seeing happening. And then if in your lending, if you're aligning behind that, pushing on the progress where we need to see it, in this country, that would be particularly about green mortgages, for example, and encouraging decarbonised buildings, because that's something that policy's lagging on. Then we have a kind of ecosystem that's actually pushing us on genuinely towards net zero. Now, how long did it take me to describe that? But that's much, much more meaningful than having net zero in a business.
Sure. I might. Yeah. And I'd say, if people are okay, we might go another 10, 15 minutes. I know I'm in the way of you guys in drinks, but so if anyone has to leave and go, feel free, but otherwise we will take some more questions. And I will also just comment, the target legal thing has disturbed some corporates and investors who've pulled out of places because their lawyers say, like, we can provide no evidence for a target, so we'll have to go. Whereas if it was actually more vague, but you had the right strategy, they would have stayed with the flotilla of ships, which is one of the again, no consensus asking on that. So please.
Thank you, Isabel Hilton. Thanks very much. Chris, I don't know one comment. I don't know if it came up in your conversation with the producers, but there is some really interesting work going on, led by RGS, on how you get climate narratives into things like soap operas, working with television and film producers. So it's how you kind of, generalise the climate narrative in a less clunky way. Yeah,
so
great.
I was saying that just that to them, and I'm sorry I'm using up time here, but that's exactly what I was saying to them, is you've got this kind of discussion. They all want to make programmes about how bad it is, and it is bad, right? But there's another thing about what EastEnders is showing you.
Yeah, just to say that work is actually happening. Great. So to encourage you, my question though was, I don't know if you've read 5 Times Faster, the recent Simon Sharp book. He's, I could say, robust on the question of equilibrium economics, but he also makes the point on the tax and subsidy argument that I mean, he points to, for example, the dissemination of EVs in Norway as a very strong and robust case for consumer subsidies, not producer subsidies. It seems to work if you want to get behaviour change. And that doesn't seem to get very far in this country. And the serial failure, for example, to find an effective subsidy regime for the most obvious thing, which is domestic energy efficiency, insulation, is enormously frustrating. Can you explain why we're so rubbish
I completely
at this?
agree. I mean, but on Norway, quite interesting. So I haven't read Simon's book, but I know Simon well, and we've talked along over the years. And we have always looked at Norway and the work we've done on EVs as well. One of the reasons we've not pushed the Norway subsidy regime, apart from the fact it's very expensive, is because what Norway's done is cherry-pick the cream of the EV supply globally. And we don't think that's the way to think about the transition, because we want to have a transition in this country that is sustainable as part of a global transition. So not to say what they've done is wrong, it's just that I think we would have ended up in hot water if we'd said the UK should follow suit, because actually there aren't enough EVs in the world. It would have been a very expensive thing, and we would have been pulling out essentially all of the EV supply and bringing it to the UK. So we've always had that idea kind of restraining us, constraining us. The broader thing is look how effective it's been, is what I would say about Norway. And I think that's the point you're making. So I absolutely agree with you. We don't get this right, and it very interesting. I don't know quite how to describe what this situation tells me really. But we used to have the subsidies for consumers in place up to 2012 to do the home insulation, and we were doing literally millions of home insulation measures in this country. And then austerity politics came along. Ed Davey, of all people, is the guy who pulled away he did it under duress, so, but he pulled away the policy framework. And sure enough, it collapsed. The biggest challenge here is you could put that framework back in tomorrow, and actually the government tried to do just that, you might remember. What has gone is trust. So you've got a set of supply chains who were just at that point gearing up, and then were lots of job losses in that sector. That is enormously difficult to bring back. So I think there's a whole host of things here that story tells you, actually, that it's not just about production subsidies. Again, I'll go back to some of the behavioural economics, actually. Once you introduce a production subsidy, it turns out when you do it the first time, it's very effective because people get excited about it, but then you've got to stick with it. And it's the sticking with it bit that we've commented on in my work. It's the flip-flopping stuff, and that's where you get this very damaging thing where if there's no trust that will be there in the future, or if there isn't that kind of certainty of how it will be removed, at least, the supply chains don't coagulate around it, and you don't get the response that you need. So I think we need to be better at not just thinking about the kind of fiscal arguments, but also thinking about the behavioural stuff alongside it, I think.
Great. We'll go to the back there and then to the left.
Hi there, Adam from Holocene Impact Capital. Just to clarify, are we on Chatham House rules? It's not controversial. Just curious.
Actually, so we're not
okay.
on the Chatham House rules.
Anyways.
So
no, it's not controversial.
It's traditionally defined because you announce yourself so people will know.
Well, yeah.
Will know who you are.
But I mean,
so you can't.
I don't know if it's on the record or what.
Yourself.
Anyways, conscious of everyone's drinking time. My question is on net zero, and I liked how you framed it before. Is it overrated or underrated? What would be your opinion on that, given that it allows for people to continue what they're doing, which may be harming the planet, but we know we're going to overshoot it. So as a concept, is it harmful? Is it actually beneficial? So overrated, underrated?
That's a good question.
Overall. And so that's not just the carbon offset piece, but the overall concept.
Net zero.
Yeah. I still think it's very valuable. So, I mean, the first thing about net zero is it is a real thing. So you cannot avoid it. So we've given it the term net zero, but it is just the point when and net zero CO2, we should make this point, net zero CO2 as distinct from net zero greenhouse gases. But when you reach balance with CO2 emissions, the planet stops warming. So you cannot avoid that. It's a scientific outcome that you need to achieve if you want to arrest climate change. The broader question, though, about whether it has value is just fascinating. I think it still does, but I do worry about that now more than I used to. And the kind of it's now a kind of catch-all term that in this country, happily not in every country, but in this country is now increasingly associated with this kind of culture war thing, which I think is a terrible shame. And I worry about that. And the other kind of point, I suppose, about this is that it does permit things to happen that are destructive to the climate. So, you know, I think it only has value as a sort of slogan if it is about a genuine transition to something. I think in this country it is. So that's my view. Therefore, the story on corporates having net zero targets worries me, actually, because if those corporates, if they achieve net zero on paper and that does nothing for the climate, then it clearly isn't a valuable thing. And perhaps we're at that point now. And maybe I'll make the slightly more, we're not under Chatham House, but I don't mind saying this publicly. Maybe it is time to retire net zero as a kind of catch-all slogan. I need to think about net zero in the job I do because it is a measurable thing, and you know that is important. The outcome matters, but maybe it's okay to talk about the fact that there are a host of other reasons to do the things that get you to net zero. And I think that increasingly is how I've thought of it, actually, that we are turning off a whole part of the audience, actually, by just talking about net zero. If you don't like net zero, you might like energy security. If you don't like net zero, you might like jobs. If you don't like energy security, you might like national pride. You know, you might like, you know, beautiful landscapes. These are all valid reasons to do the things that lead you to net zero without you having to make net zero the thing. It's slightly weird that we've done all this for reasons of climate. And I think that is always going to be tricky. So I think we probably do need to stretch it out into just, you know, going back to, I think, what in the UK, the Climate Change Act was really about in the first place. It wasn't really about inspiring action. It was about keeping everything within a sort of, keeping the guardrails in place. And that, you know, that probably does involve us having a more interesting discussion about what net zero actually means.
And we mentioned climate jobs are jobs, and
just jobs.
Climate health is health. So there is something with that. Please.
So, Ben, Chris, I know neither of you are macroeconomists by trade, but I think one of the things for me, and I know, Chris, you referenced sort of the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. several times. One of the things that concerns me was sort of the way the Inflation Reduction Act, you know, well, one, other than the fact that it's a sort of like a very nationalist, sort of protectionist type, you know, sort of fiscal act, is the fact that actually a lot of the onshoring that will take place will be, in definition, inflationary. Right, because labor in the U.S. is more expensive than it is in, you know, Taiwan, China, Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. And while I think it's nice to sort of look at it from abroad and sort of see that experiment take place, one of the things that I worry about is, for example, countries like the UK were at a much higher sort of inflation level to sort of start with. The central bank has a lot less tools in its toolkit to deal with it. While I get sort of the need for production subsidies, what I do worry about is if, for example, the UK or, you know, for example, the EU tries to copy the Inflation Reduction Act and sort of apply parts of it or apply subsidies, it could actually sort of backfire massively. So I don't know if you or Ben, if you guys have any comments on that, but it'd be great to sort of just put that out there, because I just find the sort of like the whole, you know, the way the act is named sort of a, you know, hilarious oxymoron.
So can I make the point now that I basically agree with everything you said there about it? So I think it's great that the US has done something because they needed to, and I think this is probably the only thing they could do, actually, is my reading of. I mean, you'll know US politics better than me, I suspect, but if not this, then what? But it does carry all those risks. And you used the word experiment. I suppose that's how I view it as well. I'm not really sure how it will play out. And for what it's worth, I think I have lots of concerns with it, actually. That's one of them. The other one is actually you've got to do a lot of fossil fuel stuff to get access to ERA. And that's another worry, actually. And back to the question about the transition to net zero, maybe that's important, but it does worry me. I think the reason to not worry too much about it is that we cannot do an ERA here. So we'll have to do something else. What I do feel we need is an industrial strategy for climate. And it's not really my job to advise the government to do that, but my God, it's needed, right? So this is, what are we doing with all this if it's not to try and secure some sort of advantage from it all? So I find that very frustrating in this country. I think the EU's clocked onto that as well. I mean, they could do an ERA, but won't. But they are doing similar things. One of the most interesting things about the kind of post-Brexit landscape in Europe is that you've got a really important tax for the environment, the EU ETS. Had the UK still been part of the club in Europe, we would have prevented hypothecation of that revenue for green stuff, because it's a standard issue UK approach that you don't hypothecate taxes. The minute we're off, that's what they've done. So a kind of interesting thing that the kind of EU's approach to the response to the US is to use those ETS revenues and other things to encourage member states to only look at green stuff, to sort of use those revenues to support green stuff. I don't know whether that's what that's going to do, but it's very interesting to me that that's what's happened with the UK's departure. We're not going to be able to match that. So we're going to have to be much cuter, I think, about what it is that we think, and we're going to have to be much better at deciding which industries we really do want to support. And I think that maybe brings to a broader point, which is that UK leadership on climate, a thing that ministers like to talk a lot about. I think there is a world where we continue to have UK leadership on climate. We can't pretend to be in charge of everything any longer. We never have been. We did once have a COP. We're not part of the EU bloc any longer. What is it we are here for? We're going to have to pick a few things, right? So this is kind of story of being selective about what it is we really want to lead on is, I think, the story. And I think in that world, if we do have really good policymakers in this country, if we could select those priorities, put proper policies around them, and avoid some of the pitfalls that you talked about, then I think we would have a better system even than ERA. But I think that's doable. So that's what I would like, and that's how you step around these risks, I think.
Yeah. So I agree with some of the worries. My one short comment would be, I think this is a policy thing. I think in US the counterfactual was nothing. So actually, if that's your counterfactual, then yeah. And actually, we had this in healthcare and some stuff. Sometimes your counterfactual is doing nothing. And so actually experimenting with something is better than that counter. All right, another couple of questions. I wonder whether we can prioritize shorter questions. It's probably going to be impossible, but we will give it a go. So I'll go for those two on the right, and then we'll see you coming on the time.
Very quick one. Underrated, overrated, CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Thanks.
Big fan of CBAMs, but again, has to be done well. So UK can't do that alone. So we'll have to align, I think, to something that looks very much like Europe, and however you look at it. That really is not the direction of policy. So I find that the CBAM thing is kind of essential, really. But I'm not sure how we get from here to there.
Great.
Just two quick questions, but big ones. The oil and gas industry, Aramco, 2.3 trillion sovereign wealth fund, they have contributed, I believe, 4% of the world's climate change emissions since the 1960s, in that part of the world. But ultimately, they have that financial capital to make huge change and investment. Do you think that's real? And is that something we should be looking to, the oil and gas industry investing in that change with the money it's accumulated and increasingly accumulated? And finally, Just Stop Oil, disruptive on-the-street protest to bring this constantly to our attention. Do you think that's a valuable part of this process of keeping the pressure for political, business, social, economic change?
Damn it. So that's the question I hope no one would ask. Yeah. I don't know what I think about Just Stop Oil. I'll be completely honest with you. They're definitely being successful at keeping things in the mainstream discussion. But I do worry that it might be a destructive thing, actually, because what I definitely see, because I'm all over the coverage of climate, is such a polarised discussion now that the progress we were making a few years ago is not possible now. So you've got a climate minister right now who's more keen on oil and gas than he is on climate. So I worry about that, actually. As you run up to an election, politicians speak to their constituencies, and it's not in their interest to entertain the Just Stop Oil thing. I don't know if that means they should stop. I mean, I think we need to keep these issues top of the pile. It's interesting that XR have stepped back from doing a lot of the stuff they were doing before, so that's an interesting one. I wish I had a better answer to that question, because it was the topic this morning with the broadcast as well. Interesting. When it comes to oil and gas and Saudi Aramco and all these big things, Again, that's another challenge. I kind of think actually it's good to have a COP in Dubai because it's going to absolutely flush out the problem, and I don't know. There's every chance that COP28 will be a disaster because of this thing because it just jars so much. But interesting, I think if there's going to be a successful outcome, and COPs themselves get overstated because actually all the work's done before the COP. So the COP itself is a sort of trade show of sorts. I'm sure this one will be a trade show. But the most kind of optimistic framing I can take from the COP28, if it's going to be a success, is that this will be the COP that puts the focus on the just transition properly. So maybe that's the way into this thing, that you've got to be able to describe to petrostates and others what the positive outcome at the end of this is. I think there's more willingness than there has ever been to discuss the fact that you cannot forever have these revenues from oil and gas. And if the COP28 presidency is going to have some success in this, I think it's to try and bring some more positivity about what the alternative is in terms of jobs. So that would be good, I think. And it's interesting, that is the sort of thing they've been thinking about. I know that the COP28 team's been working with McKinsey, for example, to try and come up with some clearer indicators globally of the just transition and what you would need, therefore, to direct to make sure that this transition is fair and equitable, even for petrostates. That is something I think we need to talk about.
Great. I think we'll try the last two questions unless people are really keen. Oh, so many. We'll just do those two.
Thank you both. And this may be a question that you can maybe both have a view on as well. So coming back to your adaptation point, do you think companies are thinking enough about adaptation for 5-10 years' time and how it's going to actually impact their business? I'm thinking most recently we saw the Gulf of Mexico, the whole chemical complex along there was shut down for weeks, if not months. Phoenix in the US, you're no longer allowed to effectively build any buildings because of water issues. And then you had drought strawberries in Spain last week as well getting mentioned. It's going to be a financial risk to businesses, but it doesn't seem to me they're doing enough. And what can we as investors push them to do?
What do you think? I know what my answer is.
You can go first. A brief comment. There's a range of views and strategies within companies, and I guess if you're a market believer, you're kind of going to be hoping that for the long term, investors are putting the capital to more resilient, more forward-looking companies and away from the former. And if you get your market to work over the long term, those former companies will go bankrupt. So that is actually over time what the rules of capitalism, sustainable capitalism, has said. And I think there is differentiation within companies. And I do think actually a bunch of investors will know that. There are different processes and things made with that. And there is a slow nudging. There's a lot of arguments about, do we see it in stock price? Do we see it in cost of capital, the like? But when you look at the long arc of history and the long arc of business formation and when they go, so over 10-year periods or 10 or 20-year periods, that has held true and I think will continue to hold true because markets and companies are really a reflection of society and humans. And what we kind of want for our future, we lean into, and what we don't, those companies go bankrupt and have over the arc of history.
Right. I think on adaptation, I don't think corporates value it as highly as they should, but I also understand why they do that. So most corporates have a time horizon that doesn't bring in some of the biggest climate risks, but I think increasingly really should actually. Now, I'd make this point because I think we in our work, and it's true for the government as well, need to be better at talking about, yes, there are a range of climate futures, but actually the range is really narrow to 2050. So I'm afraid most climate change is baked into 2050. That means we should be much better, I think, at describing the future that we see when it comes to the need for adaptation and the risks that we face in this country and more broadly the supply chains that corporate might be exposed to. I think we should be able to describe more clearly what's going to happen over the next 10, 20 years. And there will always be kind of these sort of long tail risks that come along. I think we can also describe that too. So, the sort of low probability, high impact stuff, we know what those things are. So I think this is a challenge that we've internally set ourselves in the Climate Change Committee actually, is to illustrate that better so that you bring into prospect genuine commercial decisions in that frame. So that 5-year time horizon, many corporates don't think in 5 years, sadly, but that let's say that they do. I think you can say that within that 5 years, something like water shortage is a real thing that you need to build into business planning. So I think in this country, you're seeing more and more, actually, even in this country, the water shortage is a bigger factor. That is much bigger in other parts of the world, of course. But it often runs counter to sort of population movement in this country is towards the east at the moment. And that's the problem. One of the biggest problems is that the water shortages are all in the east. So if you get that really matters, actually. You should be thinking about that. And that there may be moments with just to use the water shortage thing. I mean, that is something that we need business continuity planning to adapt to. It would be helped if we were able to illustrate that better, and I think we can do that. So we have these brilliant climate projections in this country, but we've been rather too focused on trying to kind of hold open a big space for scenarios, because we've been worrying about these long tail risks. I think we can narrow it a bit, talk about the climate change that we can say with some certainty now that we're going to see in this country, and then we'll have better planning around it corporately.
And it should align. I mean, a lot of pensions have 20, 30, 40, 50-year horizons that we're trying to match. Okay, last one, because I know we're in the way of drinks, so.
Thank you, and thank you all. Just a quick fan of top 10, so if we can do one on policy supporting net zero as well as adaptation, that would be brilliant. But I want to actually go back to nature positive. Should we be setting up the same sort of climate change committee and structure that we've done that to make us nature positive, or should we be integrating it?
Until it can be defined better, I worry about that, actually. So maybe that is the first act of this new nature committee, or whatever we call it. I mean, that was something that worked quite well for the UK when we were created. There was already a sort of body of evidence that said it could work, but we weren't sure it could work. So the first act of the CCC was to kind of come together and put some proper evidence in place and put a target around some of these things. And I don't think we're quite at that point with nature. And I do worry about that. As I mentioned, the transition planning task force, there's a lot of pressure actually to bring in the nature positive language. Obviously, that's important. It's a fundamental. But we haven't got the same measurement tools. So I worry that we'll do it and it will seem tokenistic because we can't measure it as well. But I also think there is a way to do that through the existing institutions and frameworks. So, one of the things we've done in my time in the CCC, for example, in the last year, is actually bring together a single team now that looks across mitigation and adaptation and nature when it comes to land, agriculture and seas. So, you can put more evidence around it still with the climate framing in place. And just a brief example of how that might work. We have in this country now, post-Brexit, a set of environmental targets. One of the most interesting things about it is that they don't deal well with climate. So we had briefly a point where amongst those environmental targets, climate adaptation was one of them. And we sort of made the point back to the policymakers, it's not a one thing, it's the lens through which everything's got to be done. So you've got to think about improving nature in a warming climate. So I think there is a link to the climate thing because it is one of the fundamentals. It's not just about climate, but until we can measure it a bit better, I worry about that.
Great. So on that note, please join us for drinks, and I'd like to thank Chris once again.